Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Welcome to our presentation on top concerns of talent leaders in 2019. Today, our panel of experts will take on HR's toughest challenges for the upcoming year, including culture management, talent acquisition, and people analytics. My name is Charles Summers. It is my pleasure to be serving as your moderator during this hour. If you want to get in touch with me about future webinar topics, Outmatch specific information, or if you'd like to speak with one of our many talent experts, feel free to reach out by email at csummers@outmatch.com or just chat in your comments. Outmatch is a talent analytics organization providing predictive assessments, culture analytics, and leadership solutions through the #1 talent analytics platform on the market. Our experts can dive into your initiatives, provide solutions, and show you what kind of results to expect. We have a lot of exciting things on our roadmap around culture and leadership. And we are also about to launch new features in our assessment that allow you to quickly compare candidates against each other, compare candidates against multiple roles within the organization, and match their abilities to future roles within your organization. As Outmatch's capabilities continue to grow, we'd like you to grow with us. So when you have a chance, head over to the website and sign up for a future webinar and get a demo. You can sign up at outmatch.com/schedule a demo, and I'll go ahead and enter that into the chat box right now. There we go. As a thank you for attending today, everyone on the call will receive a free copy of our latest ebook, an HR Buyer's Guide, How to Evaluate HR Tech in the Machine Learning Era. Our conversation today is about trends in 2019, and machine learning is a big one. This ebook will help you cut through the marketing hype, invest wisely in new technology, and ensure you're getting the most out of your AI. You can look for an email after the presentation from me that'll probably come first thing tomorrow morning. If you love trends as much as we do, please take a moment to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at OutmatchHCM. We are always posting the latest trends, best practices, and insights on hiring and talent management. We'd love to hear from you. You can also interact with us using the questions queue in the GoToWebinar status window. Please feel free to ask questions, make comments, or share feedback at any time. You can also ask questions on social media. Today's panel discussion will take approximately 45 minutes, and following that, we'll have some time set aside for audience questions. And go ahead and get those questions in as we ask our presenters questions today. We'll make sure to answer those along the way as well. Now I'd like to introduce our 3 panel experts that will help set us up for success in 2019. First, we have Oliver, founder of the culture analytics company Pomelo. Pomelo was acquired by Outmatch last year, and Oliver now serves as our Chief Financial Officer. Oliver is a firm believer that culture is a company's competitive advantage. His expertise and experience building a culture analytics solution from the ground up, and at the same time, a successful business around culture makes him our resident culture expert here at Outmatch. We also have Courtney Gear as Director of Enterprise Customer Success. Courtney works directly with our largest clients to identify and address their most pressing talent challenges, which gives a pulse on the industry and the perfect vantage point to see upcoming trends. Courtney has a solid industrial organizational background and 10 years of experience in recruiting, leadership development and training, assessment development, and consultant. And finally, we have Keith McCook, Vice President of Talent Analytics at Outmatch. Keith is an IO psychologist with 20 years of experience in talent selection and employee development. He leads our team of data scientists here at Outmatch using predictive analytics to help our clients hire the best fitting employees, resulting in measurable performance improvements and quality of hire metrics. As you can see, our panelists are experts in the areas of culture, talent acquisition, and people analytics, which are areas that we're seeing the biggest concerns for 2019. Specifically, talent leaders are looking for ways to manage workforces that are increasingly part-time or remote, and manage culture through M&A and strategic shifts. Another challenge is how to source and select talent in a consistent, cost-effective way without undermining diversity and inclusion efforts. And the last one is to increase access to data and improve their analytical capabilities in order to gain an edge in a hyper-competitive labor market. these are the topics that we'll discuss today. So I wanted to share the results of a people management report from earlier this year. This report surveyed over 600 HR executives, and it showed HR's top 5 emerging priorities as being, number 1, recruiting and talent acquisition, change management, diversity and inclusion, remote workforces, retention of high potential employees. So I'm going to start off by launching a quick poll here to start us off. Give me one moment. And I'll give everybody about 30 seconds here to get an answer in. And if you have a different focus for the coming year, please let us know in the comments. This is going to help our panelists better understand what you're most interested in learning about today. We'll give it about 15 more seconds. It's about 75% of you have voted so far. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. And you should see the results on your screen here. So I'll just quickly run through it, and this will help our experts as we navigate today's discussion. So 35% of you said recruiting and talent acquisition. And then right after that, change management and retention of high potential employees. So we'll definitely touch on those topics today. So thank you for getting in your answers today. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump into our very first question of the day, and this one's going to be directed to Oliver. So Oliver, if you had to choose one most important culture or engagement metric, what would it be?
Thanks, Charles. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm delighted to be speaking with you and answering what seems to be some questions we've got, as along with any follow-up. So please don't be shy in the chat box. Would love to kind of get to as much as possible in the time we have. In terms of the most important culture and engagement metrics, I look at in the culture kind of analytics world, we look at on the culture side, it's what we call culture strength. It's an indicator that essentially measures how much alignment is there in people's understanding of what culture is. The more commonly understood and shared and held the values and beliefs are within a team, within an organization, the more effective, the higher performing that team is. They know what they're working towards, why they're working towards it, and ultimately how to achieve those goals. It's the what's left in the room when the leader's not there kind of concept. So that culture strength indicator really distills all of that down into one quantitative metric that can directly measure and track a team's alignment around their understanding of those shared values and culture. On the engagement side, I'd say it's a concept some of you may be familiar with called ENPS, Employee Net Promoter Score. So there's a lot of different ways, obviously, to measure engagement. But at the end of the day, if you think about what an engaged workforce is, it's a set of employees who are highly motivated by the work they're doing, motivated by the team they're doing it with, and ultimately advocates for that work and for that team. And so that Employee Net Promoter Score is a way to capture that advocacy component quite effectively.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So, 2 quick takeaways from that I got, and you can tell me if I'm off. But I got, from the culture standpoint, I got kind of, culture strength and alignment and understanding of culture throughout the organization, and then for engagement, I got, Employee Net Promoter Score. Would you say that's kind of accurate in summarizing that slide?
It is, yep. And the importance here, I think the overarching point here around metrics, the reason those are important is these tend to be qualitative areas, so adding quantitative measurements key, And when you have data, you can run, quarter over quarter, year over year comparisons and benchmark, right? You can benchmark against industry standards if you've got data from other companies. So that's another kind of reason to focus on these metrics around culture and engagement.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I did have a question come in from the audience already, just going back to the very beginning of the presentation on how to get the machine learning file. It is, if you look at the handout section in your status window, you can actually get it there. I'll also send an email with it after the webinar today. Okay, appreciate your help on that one, Oliver. We'll go ahead and jump into the next one. And again,
Charles, I think
Oliver,
there actually might be a question in the chat box. I'm reading it here. I think it says,
Yep.
How do you measure culture strength? So that's a great question. Ultimately, software tools are really helpful in this respect. Measuring culture does require kind of validated methodology around it, and there's a couple of good ones out there. Not to overly plug Pomelo, but that is in fact a culture strength measurement tool. So what we do is we, through a set of online surveys and exercises, collect information around how employees perceive and understand the relative importance of certain values, certain behaviors, and norms within the organization, and essentially are measuring how much agreement they have through those survey responses. And then you can, segment the data by team, by geography, by hierarchy, which will dovetail with this question. In some cases, especially with, I know diversity wasn't a big point of interest for the attendees on this particular webinar, but with the whole D&I revolution these days, a lot of companies are looking at this in terms of gender. Do men and women within an organization perceive culture the same? Are they being impacted in different ways? So, the short answer is finding a measurement tool that works for your needs and that has a validated methodology will help you generate a culture strength indicator for your organization and for your teams.
Great, thank you. I hope that answers our audience question. If it doesn't, please, add another follow-up question in there for us. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next one here for Oliver. Oliver, how do you deal with leadership that talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk?
Yeah, that's another great question, and this tends to arise when things tend to be qualitative in nature, right? And so that's why adding data, injecting data into the conversation changes the conversation in many respects from one of, I think to I know, or this is what the data says. So we've encountered organizations where leadership teams themselves have, come to the realization that they don't walk the talk, so to speak, because they think culture is one thing and they're talking about it in a certain way, right? They might have values up on a wall, they themselves may live by those, but then when they measure culture across the organization, what they see is there's actually structural things that are creating hurdles for that culture and those values that they hold at the leadership team level to actually flow through the organization. It could be as simple as, how they set up incentive programs or compensation, how they reward employees, who they promote, how they hire. And so by measuring organizational culture, leadership teams can become much more aware of how closely they are walking the talk. And if, you're in an organization where this really needs to be a grassroots bottoms up effort, there's a lot of things you can do to measure just a small team, measure a department, use that data to better inform, how that team is perceiving and understanding the values and how that ties back to an overarching concept around culture for an organization. So again, measurement tends to be the way to overcome this.
Right. Yeah. So basically, kind of a shift from, if you're kind of going off of a qualitative type thing. Making that first step, kind of taking the shift towards a qualitative approach and adding data to your process can help alleviate some of those things.
Yep, qualitative to quantitative, absolutely.
Right. Sure. Cool. So we got another question here for you, Oliver. Then our next question we'll jump over to Courtney. So for this one, how do you manage culture in a company that has varying subcultures across brands?
This is a great question, and tends to go hand in hand with the question of, are subcultures, a net add or a net detraction from, an overarching culture? And the larger the company, the more likely there are subcultures. And those aren't necessarily a bad thing. Subcultures can be incredibly powerful if they are highly aligned, right? Again, that culture strength indicator way up there, and really defines with a clear sense of mission, purpose, and values what that team, what that department's supposed to be doing. The way to manage this at an organizational level, when you do have a lot of these subcultures around the company, is to ensure that there is what we think of as kind of a common core, right? So if you look at kind of the values that define each of these teams, there needs to be enough overlap in a set of those values that roll up into what we would call kind of an overall organizational core value structure. When you have that, then you still have everybody pointed in the same direction on the most important values, but they're allowed to optimize, or given the freedom to optimize the importance of one or the other of the value depending on what part of the organization they're in, right? A great case is for many organizations thinking about their R&D department, right, or their engineering teams. In many cases, the values around innovation, adaptability, experimentation need to be heightened, as opposed to, possibly if you've got a large legal arm within an organization, where experimentation may not be as highly valued. So subcultures can be incredibly powerful. Many of the large organizations will have subcultures. What you want to do is ensure that there's enough commonality amongst them that creates a common core across the organization and a common language and framework within which to discuss culture.
So Oliver, how do you, where do you start? So, you have some subcultures, and maybe there's not a lot of alignment, like you mentioned, overlap in values that roll up into the overall, company level values. What if there is an alignment? Where do you start, and how do you address that?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and tends to occur in many of the companies we've done work with around M&A, right? So you'll have acquired a company, and so you end up, in many cases, you might have acquired a couple of companies in a short period of time, and you'll end up with, fairly disparate cultures all rolling up into what should be an organizational umbrella. And so this notion of kind of, cultural integration, so to speak, or creating that common core can take a lot of time. But again, measurement is your friend in this case, because culture tends to be an emotional conversation. And so if you actually start by measuring what the culture looks like in all these, different units, let's say, what you can do is start there and look for the greatest degree of commonality. Inevitably, there will be a shared value, even if it's just one that you can tease out. And that becomes the starting point. That's the foundation upon which to build. And so it's less around what's going to change in your culture as we're creating more of a common culture around the organization, and starting from a place of here's what's not going to change. This culture is one we all hold dear. This is the foundation upon which we're going to build this common core. And then we're going to, based on the area of the organization you're in, allow for freedom, as we talked about, on these sets of values. So that's how, again, it could be outside of an M&A conversation, but that's how we've approached it in the past.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. So it kind of goes back to the same thing we were saying earlier with, starting with the data, finding commonalities, and, building a common core, and, within that culture, there's freedoms on values. So, thank you for that. And I had another follow-up question, but you answered it. So thank you for that. Okay, Courtney, so I've got your first question here. How to prepare, or how do you prepare hiring filters for culture? I'm sorry, this question is written a little weird. How do you prepare hiring filters for culture, assess the culture fit of job applicants?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. So I think when it comes to hiring for culture, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So first of all, culture screening tools are really useful to help reduce some bias and bring automation to the process. So if you think about preparing your hiring managers to hire better, right, a lot of it is what data are you providing to them to make a good decision. So for example, if you use something like a culture screening tool, you could essentially create a benchmark right on the back end that provides the hiring managers a good baseline for knowing whether someone is a good fit. And bringing that data and objectivity to the process is really what is going to help them identify who's more likely to be a fit. Because we know that culture is tied to performance, it's tied to lower turnover. If you're hiring people that are more likely to be successful in the organization and more likely to be a culture fit, they're more likely to stay. So I think it boils down to, really ensuring your hiring managers have the right data to start from, and giving them the tools and resources to make good decisions.
Thank you. I do have one follow-up question here, actually,
Sure.
right from the audience. How does one create a culture screening tool?
Yeah, no, great question. So we offer a culture screening tool at Outmatch. There's lots of different options out there, but what I would encourage you to look for is there are a lot of tools that aren't always backed in data. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're really going to find value, right? Is it's important to understand what drives performance at your company, what the culture of your company is. And once you kind of have that mapped out, then you can bring people in that align to it. So what I would encourage you to do is, we've got a great tool at Outmatch. We're happy to get you more information on. But in general, looking for tools that really can, I think you can hone into your culture, right? It's not about kind of a one size fits all. Culture is very unique to each organization. And so it's important that you are hiring to your specific culture.
And this is Keith from Outmatch. Courtney, you touched on a really good point there, which is really giving some hard thought to what that target is. When you're taking a look at how potential applicants align with the culture, you need to think about what the target culture is. Oliver brought up a good point that a lot of times in organizations you might have multiple cultures, and so what's the level of analysis? Are you hiring for the company overall? Are you hiring for a particular department? Mm-hmm. Or are you sort of looking at an aspirational culture that's future oriented, and how do we want people to align with our culture moving into the future as opposed to the way it's been defined in the past? So I think there's a lot of different directions you can go, and it's worth really sort of scratching your head and thinking carefully about what the target is, so that you make sure you point the organization in the right direction, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm working with a few different clients now that are really focused on that future-oriented culture, the aspirational culture, as we talk about. And it's an interesting kind of philosophical question, because if you are intentionally trying to shift your culture, hiring people to a future culture can be a little tricky, right? Because if the current culture doesn't mimic where you're going, you could be hiring people that are less likely to be a fit. But some organizations are willing to do that in an effort to shift their culture. So I think the important takeaway is it doesn't shift overnight. It takes time, and it takes a lot of champions in the organization to really agree on where you're going. You can do it for sure, and I think culture tools help you get there, but it's an important distinction to Keith's point of where's that target and where are you headed.
Yeah, do you think I think in the long term, I think we would all agree that there's a lot of positives to doing that. Do you think in the short term, you mentioned, hiring people for the future, and then, that doesn't align with the current culture. Do you think that there's, some problems that exist there? Like, do you think that could cause issues within the organization in the short term?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it has to be an intentional decision, right? So whenever I have clients that are really on a culture transformation path, right? Typically that we start off with a conversation to say, okay, where are you going and how different is that from where you are today? And so generally our approach is to assess current culture and aspirational culture. And then that gap, right, is kind of where we start to figure out, okay, how different is your future versus current, and what kind of changes or initiatives are in play to get you there. Because if you're hiring someone to a future culture, so say you are moving to a culture that's, less rigid, really values independent thought, and kind of everyone working on their own. But today you're very process oriented. There's a lot of rules in place, a lot of procedures. If you start hiring all these independent minded people that try to change things, that's not going to work in your very process driven culture, right? And so I think it's important to recognize, what are the shifts I'm trying to make? How far down the path am I, right? Like, have you put things into play where if you're moving away from a process oriented culture, have you stripped away those processes already, or is that on the roadmap? And then you have to kind of make decisions. So for us, generally, we're going to take a little bit more of a conservative approach probably, and pick something a bit in between, would be my best recommendation, right? You may go, okay, down the road, our goal is to become X, but for now, we are going to focus on Y, but we're going to focus on these core pieces that aren't going to change, and kind of hire against that, so that over time, and then use things like interview questions, right, to identify people that are more likely to be a fit in the long term. Because the worst thing you can do is just continue to hire to your current culture, and then it's much harder to shift down the road. So yeah, it's definitely something I think you've got to have your leaders on board. You've got to make an organizational decision, and it's not to be made lightly, right? Culture shift is not something that happens overnight.
Right. So it kind of goes back to what Oliver was saying earlier, and you mentioned it a couple of times. Really defining what the commonalities are between current versus future, and setting goals and using data to help you get there.
Correct. Absolutely agree.
Cool. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. Okay, Courtney, this one's also for you. What do you do when hiring managers ignore the process and default to their intuition?
So this never happens. Never. No, we get this a lot, right? We're in the business of pre-hire assessments and bringing as much objectivity and data to the process as possible. But you always have that hiring manager out there that says, well, I've hired in this role for 20 years. I know what good looks like, and I'm going with my gut. And a lot of times in those instances, right, I try to start talking about, okay, well, let's look at the assessment and what we're trying to hire against, right? And I use the assessment because generally that's, what our clients are using as a sort of screening tool. And you have hiring managers that aren't quite bought in, right? They don't quite see the value in it. And so they're ignoring those assessment results because they feel like this is someone that they should make an exception for. But time over time, the data says otherwise, right? The whole purpose of a pre-hire assessment is to really increase the odds of that person being successful. It's to try to find people who are more naturally a fit for the role, who have the innate capabilities to do well in that role. And likely, if you're hiring someone who's good at something, they're just going to be better at the job, right? So it's all about kind of increasing your odds. So I think that it's important to show the value to hiring managers by talking to them about, and oftentimes it's giving examples of, well, let's look at someone who's been successful in the job, and what are those traits or what are those innate abilities that have made them successful. And oftentimes you can point back to, well, those are the things we're measuring in the assessment. So I'll take the restaurant industry, for example. If you're hiring general managers, right, you want people who are quick to action, like a lot of variety, have a pretty high work pace, are accommodating, but not to the point where, they'll give away the store, and, are assertive, are going to speak up. So generally, you can get an idea of that's going to paint a pretty strong restaurant general manager. Well, when someone doesn't do well in the assessment, you can talk through some of those general traits and say, okay, let's talk about how someone's going to deal with that. People have all the time will develop strategies to overcome some of those natural tendencies, right? We see that a lot. But it takes a lot of experience, it takes a lot of intention, and over time, it wears people down. It can lead to burnout and more stress. So I think the point here is that the assessment is intended to help you find people that are more likely to be a good fit. If you have exceptions to that, I think you just need to think through what those exceptions are. And if a hiring manager wants to go against wants to go with their intuition and go against the data, oftentimes you then have opportunities on the back end to say, well, let's look at these other instances when you've hired. So in my experience, it's really sticking with the data. It's helping them understand what we're trying to measure, and that the goal is not to be a blocker in their process, but to reduce the number of hires going forward, right? Because if you can reduce turnover, you can improve quality of hire. It should ideally make their job easier.
Mm-hmm. And Courtney, you touched on a couple of important points there, which I think if you shift this question a little bit, you started to get at some of this, which is that there's also a strategy that you would take in these cases where you try to get the hiring managers not to ignore the process, and I think you can do that by helping them be bought into the to the assessment tool in the first place, or whatever the components of the hiring process are that we're implementing are. And so I think when we do these types of programs, when we put a selection process in place, the more we can get input from those hiring managers, and make sure that the solution that we're delivering reflects their influence. They have great information about what leads to success in the role, and so if we can collect that and reflect the ways that we've heard what they're saying and program that into the assessment tool or the overall interview, then I think we can get them bought in and a little less resistant in the first place too, which sometimes that's a good way to approach the battle as well.
Yeah, I think it's about why are they not bought in, right? Why do they not see the value in it? And sometimes, some people may say, well, that's you could ask all day, but I do think there's value. If your operators aren't seeing the value in it, right, then there's a reason. And so oftentimes, how was the assessment implemented? What training have they had? I had a client one time where the managers just didn't really know how to read the reports, and so they didn't want to use them. That was a very simple training to then say, hey, this report is really easy. Here are the key things to look at. Suddenly compliance is where it should be, right? And so sometimes it's a much easier conversation. You just have to ask the why first.
Right. Yeah. And so you had a really good example right at the very beginning. You kind of mentioned, this hiring manager has 20 years of experience. They're like, I don't want to go through the process because, I know what successful looks like. And Keith, you kind of summed it up really good. Like you can actually work that kind of intuition and understanding of what makes somebody successful into the assessment and into the process. Do you think that there's do you think some intuition is good, within the process?
I would chime in, and I would say what they maybe what oftentimes hiring managers are calling intuition really is experience-based judgment. They've done it for a long time. They really understand the role, and they're able to make quick, almost seemingly intuitive judgments that actually reflect a lot of years of facts and data that have been accumulated. And I think when it's that type of information, it can only help the hiring decision. So from an assessment standpoint, we're giving a recommendation, or we're giving a rich set of data that helps increase the likelihood of making an accurate hire, and then that compounded with the great information that the hiring managers have in terms of their understanding of the job and what makes people successful is going to equal a better overall hiring decision. So I think that's some of what comes into play as well, is just painting this overall picture of different voices in the assessment process, taking the voice of the assessment plus the voice of the behavior-based interview plus the voice of reviewing the application, compiling all that together to have the clearest picture of whether somebody's going to be successful or not.
Yeah, and I would add too, I think hiring managers' intuition can be really meaningful when it comes to the interview, right? Because, essentially, you got to think there's an algorithm that is taking someone's responses and determining whether or not they're a fit, right? And at some point, humans, I think it's important that they're involved in the hiring process, right? We would never recommend make a hiring decision based on the assessment alone. But I think that a hiring manager, to Keith's point, can pull in that experience, right? And really dig into, okay, let me kind of validate what I'm seeing in the assessment, right? It's saying this person is very low sociability, right? So they're not one who is necessarily looking for opportunities to collaborate with other people, or they're just not someone who's necessarily looking for those opportunities or enjoys interacting with a lot of others. So in the hiring manager's interview, they can probe through interviews, right? If that's something that will be a derailer for them. Back to my restaurant example, right? You kind of need social people that are going to interact with customers. But if it's a back of house position, may not be as important. So I think that's where the restaurant managers or the hiring manager's judgment can really come into play.
Great, thanks. Thank you both for your input there. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question. And again, I'm going to direct this one to Courtney. Courtney.
Charles, are you still there? You broke out as you were about to say the question. Okay, I'll go ahead and just jump into the answers. So I can see the question, how do companies prevent discrimination if their values screen out a protected class? So I'll caveat by saying I'm not a legal expert. So I want that out on the table first. But I think when it comes to being legally defensible, there are a couple things that really come into play. So consistency in process and using data to drive your decisions. So if you want to prevent discrimination, I think those two things come up over and over again. So when I talk about consistency in the process, really what I'm saying is every candidate should be treated the exact same. So everyone that applies for one position should be taken through the same assessment, should be ideally asked from the same bank of interview questions, the same number of interviews. Like having that consistency is really key. So I think that's part one. And then the second piece of the data-driven component. So I think that it's important if you know what drives success. So whether that is through kind of stakeholder interviews, right? So we do job analysis where we observe the job and we talk to leaders and high performers and understand what drives success in the job. That then leads to a scoring algorithm that essentially someone is compared against when they apply. So that data is what is driving the overall decision. And knowing that it is company specific or based on our research, our database, is much better than the back of the napkin, right? Here are the values that are important, I want to hire against them. And so I think where companies can sometimes get a little bit in hot water is that they don't have data backing it up and they treat everyone differently. So I think those two things will really keep you protected when needed.
Thanks. And I did lose audio for a moment, so I apologize. I did miss the first part of the response there. So I do have one follow-up question here. And you may have addressed this in the first part of your question that I missed, but I'm just going to ask it. How would you address concerns that hiring for a specific profile of top performers could create a monoculture within the organization and decrease diversity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was thinking about this earlier when I was kind of prepping, and monocultures, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because it's like you're trying to hire people that align to the organization so they stick around and they're happy, but in reality, are you hiring kind of all the same person and decreasing diversity? I think it's a valid concern. I think I would actually turn to say, what are the goals of your organization and what are you doing to shift that culture? Because the majority of companies I think about, they have a good culture, like everyone's aligned to it, but they're not all the same, right? All the employees are not exactly all the same. And so I think it's about what are your kind of values as a company, because those values are often what will help you cross different generations, right? Things like, teamwork and valuing innovative ideas, even just, doing what's right for the customer. I mean, those things are not specific to any type of certain group. Those are things that are going to span across. So I think it's important to kind of know, again, what's your target? I know I talked about this before, but what's that target you're going towards? And as long as everyone's kind of going towards the same thing, I think you run less of an opportunity of hiring, all the same person. But I think using, a data-driven tool or even a culture screening tool or some other pre-hire assessment, those are they don't know who's applying, right? So it's much harder to bring that kind of unconscious bias into the process. So if you can use that kind of on the front end, you can bring in people across the board, right, from all sorts of different backgrounds and actually improve the diversity in the funnel. I think that's where a lot of companies get caught up is if you're not attracting all those different types of people on the front end, it's much harder to get them in the door. So I think it's about, finding ways to attract people, ensuring what that target is, and you will, in reality, I think the outcome will be you won't have this sort of monoculture concern.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one here for time's sake. Keith, I'm going to direct this one to you. So welcome, Keith. I appreciate you jumping in on those couple of questions before. How much data does a company need to get started with predictive analytics?
Well, I come from the talent analytics space, so my default answer is as much as humanly possible, but oftentimes that's not really realistic. I would say in reality, with a lot of our clients, we adopt kind of a crawl, walk, run approach, where really I think you can start out with very little data at the kind of the initiation of the relationship. So a lot of times when we're partnering with clients, we can take a look at industry data. What do we see with clients that are kind of in a similar space that have similar types of roles to this particular client? And so even before we do the first assessment, there's a lot of information, a lot of data that we can reach out and take a look at that will inform what we're doing from a selection standpoint. We can make a good estimate of what we should be looking for and the types of profiles that might make sense for success for that particular role. And so I think you can leverage industry resources and things like the ONET library to really make a good first pass at what's important for success, and then iterate on that and fine tune over time very quickly. And so I think that's one of the things is even before you have any data from a particular client, we should be able to leverage our vast amount of experience and industry data to make a good first pass. And then like I mentioned, a lot of times our relationships kind of iterate over time. As the relationship evolves and we start to gather some client-specific data, we can go back to the client and partner with them and report back our early findings. How do their people look compared to the industry averages? Where are the differences? What aligns well? What doesn't align so well? And really kind of start to calibrate and make those comparisons and look a little bit deeper. And then over time, in a more extended time frame, kind of the 6 months to a year, once they've started to really hire in significant numbers, that's typically where we take a deeper dive. And I say significant numbers, we're typically, where possible, looking at hundreds or even thousands of data points on new hires. We can really get into the territory where we can create these meaningful data insights that are really specific to our clients and refine the prediction algorithms to drive performance or focus on turnover metrics. And as that sample grows, we can continually refresh those analytics that we provide. So we can do that deep dive, fine tune the assessment for them, and then track how it's working over time so that we can really have a close relationship. And at that point, we also start to be mindful of what you call the shelf life of assessments. Once you do an initial tailored profile or you do a validation study for a client, that's going to it will get stale over time. And so part of the work that we do with our clients, where we have those types of deep data relationships and are looking at hundreds or thousands of hires on an annual basis, is we'll take a look at how the profile is working and are there adjustments, or are we seeing something different in terms of what predicts performance, and can we be in tune with that so that we fine tune it and adjust over time so that we can reflect how the client is growing, how things are changing in the role. And sometimes there's kind of strategic shifts that happen from an organization standpoint, where they shift what they're paying attention to from a sales standpoint or in terms of what matters for job performance. And all of those different voices can have an impact on the data relationships. And so we just try to partner with our clients and really understand their world the best that we can so that we can pay attention to that.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a follow-up question here. So obviously the more data, the better. Then the company can kind of tailor for their specific organization. But if they don't have any, you can default to industry information and benchmarks, and you mentioned CNET. If you don't have any data and you do have to default to kind of industry data and benchmarks and things like that, is there, could you end up looking like everyone else, or how can you still differentiate even if you don't have a boatload of data?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe the easiest way to answer that is to give an example. So we work with a lot of organizations, and pretty much any company, regardless of size, is going to have managers of some flavor in the company. They have frontline employees or individual contributors, and then managers that are overseeing the work of those folks. And you can look at the ONET library, the Department of Labor's kind of open source of information about what types of competencies or personal characteristics are important for success across a wide range of about 900 jobs. And one of the job categories that they look at is a variety of general management positions. So you could use as a starting point picking the general management position that's closest to that role. So it could be an accounting manager or a human resources manager. And ONET's going to have some really good information based on industrial psychologists that went out and did job analysis, and they could inform you about what competencies are likely to be important for that. Let's take the HR manager example. Here's the eight or 10 competencies that are important for HR managers to have to be successful. And then you could use that as a starting point. And then even if you don't have data, you can go through a qualitative process. We could use that as our initial model, and then talk to the organization about how that aligns with what they see as important for success for their HR managers, and do a series of focus groups and stakeholder interviews. And then we might shift that competency model and tailor it for the client, where we use 80% of what ONET says and then modify it based on client input to get a result that really is leveraging both the industry expertise plus the subject matter expertise from the client in-house, to give them something that's going to bridge that gap. It's going to take advantage of what we know in general works, but also make sure that it works for them and reflects what's important in their organization. And that would be a very typical example of how we kind of bridge that gap and kind of have a foot in both of those worlds, but give them something that's going to work well.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like, if you have the data, then great. I mean, it's going to benefit you. And if you don't have the data, it's going to take you a little bit more time. You got to define what those goals are. But, you can get there. So if you're not using data, definitely start doing it. In general, would you would you say, it's a barrier for smaller companies that don't have data?
I think it creates some challenges. I wouldn't say a barrier, but it may require a little more legwork to get them off of the ground and to get them something that's going to feel right to them. What we see with a lot of our smaller clients is that just because from a resource standpoint, they haven't invested quite as much in thinking about what the critical competencies are. They may not have the documentation that some of our larger enterprise clients would have around competency models and success models for a wide variety of roles. And so we might have to help them do a little bit more of that work and invest a little more energy. But we can definitely get there. There's not anything that's an absolute obstacle that would prevent us from providing them with a sound scientific solution.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
We have about 10 minutes left. We have 3 questions left, I believe. So I'll try to keep my follow-ups to a minimum here. Keith, next question here. To use predictive analytics, will I need to re-engineer my existing HR tools?
So this, I would say, is a challenge that we face with a lot of our clients, where they're wanting to get into the predictive analytics game. They come to us to develop an assessment tool that's going to identify top performers, and we're kind of faced with this challenge of how do we get from being at the start of this relationship to having assessment data linked to performance outcomes that's going to really provide some usable insights. And in my experience, it doesn't really require a re-engineering of the existing HR tools as much as it does creating pipelines or connecting the dots. So a lot of the HR tools that organizations we work with have in place work perfectly fine. So they have performance appraisal systems. They have good information on when employees were hired and the progression of roles and when they got promoted and when they left the organization. And really the work that we're doing is connecting those data sources to what we bring to the table from an assessment standpoint, so that we can tell a compelling picture, or a compelling story, so that we can paint that picture and connect a assessment results to those types of outcomes over time. And so it's a different sort of work, but it doesn't involve just throwing all of those existing tools out the window. It's just how do we connect all that data together and do that in a meaningful way. And that's where things like applicant tracking systems come into play. A lot of times that becomes the intermediary where the client has an experience that candidates are interacting with when they first meet the organization. They provide their resume and answer some basic application information. They complete our assessment, and then a lot of times through that ATS, we can tie our assessment back to the HRIS system and kind of launch off from there.
Okay, perfect. So in short, no, you don't need to. We can, think about connecting the two, connecting all the different tools together before you make a decision to re-engineer everything. So thank you for your help on that one. Okay, so this is our last question. We probably aren't going to have time for our Q&A session today. So if you do have questions, make sure you get them in now, and then we'll have somebody reach out to you and follow up on that question with you, whether that be me or one of our experts today. We'll make sure to get those questions answered. So, Keith, will new data privacy laws prevent HR from progressing into predictive analytics?
Again, here, I don't think that we're not seeing that privacy laws really prevent us from doing predictive analytics, but they definitely have created some speed bumps along the way, and they've shined a light on the importance of data protection and data privacy, and so we've had to learn to flex and work in slightly different ways. So one of the big challenges that we see with privacy laws is that a lot more attention is being placed on individually identifiable information. So name, email, employee ID, those are kind of sacred and have to be protected at all costs. And so we try to avoid dealing with those on kind of an individual record basis wherever we can. So a lot of the analysis that I do within our organization is looking at norm data. How do people in general tend to score on a particular personality scale? Or if we're looking at one of our cognitive ability measures, how do people tend to score compared to others? And that's general data that we don't need to have that individual record to do. We're just looking at group averages. We can do the same thing looking at industry comparisons. How do people in the restaurant space tend to score compared to people in the retail space? And so for those types of analysis, it's just, I think, kind of increasing that consciousness and thinking about what's the information I need to get the job done here. And if I don't need that individually identifiable information, then that shouldn't be a part of the data set that I'm working with. So trying to parse that out and only use what's required. And going back to that earlier question where we talked about connecting those HR systems, the more we can do that, the more that makes our lives a little easier. We can do a better job of talking with the client. So if the client is the keeper of that individually identifiable information and they're storing assessment data alongside of performance data, well, we can get them to match up that data and send us a file of assessment data plus job performance without the actual individual identifier record in there. We just need to know that the person scored at the 50th percentile on assertiveness and was a top performer. We don't need to know that their name was John Smith. And so the more we can do those partnerships, match up that data in a way that we can have the variables of interest without the identifiable information, then that allows us to do our job effectively and keep those data privacy standards in place.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to our last slide here. So we actually do have about 2 minutes. Keith, I have a question that came from the crowd specifically for you. When a small organization of 3,000 employees wants to go to the next level and become 10,000 employees, what are the components of HR that need to be mindful from a culture, innovation, bringing the future workers to align with today's workers in the company?
That's a big question. I can probably speak to it from a pre-employment assessment standpoint, but I would say as kind of as a caveat, I'm sure there are a lot of, especially with that kind of an increase in numbers, there's going to be all sorts of HR systems and policy and procedures, and with that massive amount of growth, you're going to have to invest a lot just in the general infrastructure of how you deal with people and how you manage people processes around hiring and onboarding and training and compliance and performance appraisal. There's a whole universe there. But just kind of peeling off the assessment piece or the selection component of that, if we're going to go out and try to hire people in an aggressive way to staff up to 10,000, in that type of situation, I would really focus on building an initial model of success and monitoring it really closely as we grow. Because I think in that type of a situation, if you have 3,000 current employees and you're going to grow to 10, we can build a model of what success looks like on that first 3,000. And then once we get to 4,000 hires, we need to take a look at it and see how things have changed. And then once we get to 6,000, we probably ought to continue to look at it, because I think as an organization is evolving along that path, that's a situation where performance expectations and the relationship of innate characteristics, which people are going to be successful in an organization, may very well drift over time. And so I think you just need to have a careful plan in place about how you're going to make sure you focus in on the signal of top performers and continue to kind of ride that curve up as growth happens.
Cool, thank you. And then the last question here is actually for me, and the audience asked, would it be possible to get a transcript of today's conversation? We do transcripts of all of our webinars. We have recordings, transcripts, and slides. The recording and the recording and the slides will come tomorrow in the email that I send. Transcript typically takes a little bit longer just because we got to go through and type it out. So yes, the answer is yes, I can get that for you. It's going to take a little bit of time, but yes, I can get that for you. Okay, so I just want to first give a big thanks to our panelists today. Lots of really, really interesting conversation and super helpful, help on the challenges going into 2019. So thank you thank you to all the panelists. I also want to thank all of our attendees for attending today's discussion of top concerns and trends for 2019. We'll continue the conversation about trends in our next webinar on how to build a high-powered HR machine in 2019. Over the past 20 years, HR has done a ton of work implementing automated workflows, integrating HR systems, and really building up an entire infrastructure that didn't exist before. What business leaders want to know is how well is it working and where we can optimize to drive even better results. So join us again next month for a deep dive into pre-hire, post-hire feedback loop. What we're calling the holy grail of HR ops. Also, there's going to be a survey that pops up here at the end. I appreciate it. It's just one question. If you could answer that question for us. If you'd like to listen back to any of our previous webinars, please go to outmatch.com/webinars or shoot me an email at csummers@outmatch.com. We'll see you all next month. Thank you.